Hi, this is Randall Schwartz, host of Floss Weekly. This week, Aaron Newcomb joins me. We're going to talk about Beagleboard, a nice little hardware board that lets you make all those wonderful hardware projects that you might be interested in. You're not going to want to miss this, so stay tuned.
Netcasts you love.
From people you trust.
This is Twit.
Bandwidth for Floss Weekly is provided by CacheFly at CACHEFLY.com.
This is Floss Weekly with Randall Schwartz and Aaron Newcomb. Episode 269, recorded October 16th, 2013. Beagleboard. It's time for Floss Weekly, the show about free, libre, open source software. I am your host, Randall Schwartz, Merlin at Stonehenge.com, bringing to you each week or as often as I can, the movers, the shakers, the big projects, the little projects, the projects you might be using every day and not know it, the projects you might not have ever heard of, but now want to go out and try. In fact, maybe this week's project, we'll see. First, I want to bring on my co-host, Aaron Newcomb. Aaron, welcome back to the show.
Hey, Randall, it's good to be here.
Too many consonants in a row. That's
too early in the
problem.
morning for this stuff.
Yeah,
come on.
I know. We're the first show on the Twit Network. We're the earliest show always on the Twit Network, and our producers have to get up real early to be able to cover this show every Wednesday, and I really appreciate that. So I'm speaking to you from the 13th floor of the Howard Hughes building in downtown LA. I'm actually looking out from a different conference. I'm actually looking out and watching planes land at LAX right now. And Aaron, you're looks like you're in the brick house.
I am in the brick house, as you can see from the lovely set here that we have. It's very nice to be here. And yeah, John was here later than I was last night. I was here for All About Android. John was here even later, so he's got to work late and then come in early for us. So big thanks to John for helping us produce the show.
Absolutely, absolutely. And so I'll let you describe our guest today, in the project we're going to talk about, because I think you have a lot more familiarity with it than I do.
Right, so we're going to be talking about Beagleboard, and Beagleboard is in a set of products that are really designed for makers. So people that may be listening to this that haven't heard of Beagleboard may be familiar with other similar projects like Arduino or Raspberry Pi is getting a lot of popularity now. And Beagleboard is right in with those. In fact, I want to know which came first, because I know Beagleboard's been around for a long time, certainly longer than the Raspberry Pi. In fact, we've had previous guests that have used Beagleboard in their projects. We had the OpenROV folks that were on, and they were using Beagleboard inside of their mini submarine, I'll call it, but it's basically a little rover that goes under the water and has cameras and stuff, and can see what's going on there. So it's a very cool project. That was featured on Make Magazine. And speaking of Make Magazine, the most recent issue of Make Magazine, if you pick it up, it's called Board Games, and it does a really good job of talking about all the various maker-style project boards that you can pick up now that are relatively inexpensive. And they have a feature in here, of course, on Beagleboard as one of the projects. They say in here, talking about the first Beagleboard, the Beaglebone. It says the Beaglebone was designed from the ground up to talk to arbitrary bits of hardware, sensors, actuators, and other electronics. It was a board designed from the start for makers rather than as an educational platform like the Raspberry Pi. So very interesting stuff here that we're going to want to talk to our guest about.
Well, it sounds like a pretty exciting show. So without further ado, let's go ahead and bring Jason Cridner onto the show. Welcome, Jason.
Hi, Randall. Thanks for having me on.
Great. And where are you speaking to us from?
I'm up in Michigan, about 45 minutes to an hour north of Detroit.
And so if you held up your hand like a glove, where are you? I'm just okay, there we go. Everybody that comes from Michigan does that little trick with their hands. So I just figured you would have to do it too.
There you go.
Awesome, awesome. So I think we introduced Beagleboard fairly well, but let's go ahead and hear it from the horse's mouth, not that you're a horse. That's just an expression. Sorry about that. What is Beagleboard, and what problem does it solve, and how did it get started?
So those are a lot of questions. So what is Beagleboard? Well, this is I'm holding up a Beaglebone, but it's about the size of an Altoids mint tin. It actually was designed to fit inside of one because a lot of makers really like to do that. It's not the Beaglebone isn't the first Beagleboard that was created. We actually started out doing something a little bit more square that was really targeting just Linux developers and trying to give them a tool that they could get started with ARM. we were kind of the first one out there to really give a desktop capable ARM platform back in 2008, something that was personally affordable. And so I just, full disclosure, I'm an employee of Texas Instruments. And that gave me a little bit of an opportunity to go and pursue this project, because we were coming out with cell phone processors and trying to take a lot of the technology that was in the cell phone processors and make it more accessible. And I had a lot of personal desire to go and build things that were more open, so that I could do my own personal hobby projects. And I was just happened to be in a nice position where I could take some of those chips and that technology and make them a lot more accessible to other people. And that's how we launched the original Beagleboard, to try to make it much easier to get access for the Linux developers. And over time, we've really gotten more involved with the maker community. And now you'll see the Beaglebone was the first one really focused on makers per se.
So what's in a Beagleboard, or picking any one of the specific models? What actually does it constitute? It's got to have some, like you said, an ARM processor in it, but what else does it have in terms of hardware?
So there's a 1 gigahertz ARM processing core, which is similar to what you have on some of the cell phones, the higher end cell phones, the smartphones today. But it's got a whole lot of built-in peripherals. You see those expansion headers on there, and that's really part of the magic of the Beaglebone. There's a tremendous amount of different peripherals and interfaces on those expansion headers for connecting up sensors and controls, things like relays, and there's analog to digital converters on there, so you can sense things with photodiodes or temperature sensors, or there's just a huge array of different things that you can start wiring up. There's 5 serial ports, there's I2C ports and SPI ports, and I can easily get into to acronym land, but the important thing is just it's a way to wire up a ton of things that interact with the physical world, sensing, controlling, and because it's a full-on Linux computer, you can use the stuff you're familiar with, like Python or Perl or JavaScript or whatever programming environment that you're comfortable with. Plug in the Ethernet, use a USB to Wi-Fi adapter, just hook it up to the internet and build your Internet of Things type of appliance. And it runs really low power consumption. You can see it down at the bottom. There's a USB host connection, so that if you want to hook up webcams and do things like vision processing using open source libraries like OpenCV, that's something that's available to you.
That sounds like an amazing amount of stuff for such a small package. So you said this thing's running Linux?
Yeah, we ship with the Angstrom distribution of Linux, but we're supported in most of the major distros out there. Gentoo, Debian, Fedora. You can run Arch Linux, ARM. There's a way to get just about every major Linux distribution out there on the board.
So the USB ports and the Ethernet ports are all basically standard devices to the Linux distribution, right? So I don't really have to think about anything differently about those?
Yeah, that's right. You just if it's a USB device that works with Linux, you just plug it in and start using it.
Wow, this is amazing. So I could, for example, use one of these to be like a Wi-Fi hotspot router for my home?
Absolutely, and if you want to do things like run, Tor, the Onion router, or things like that, it's certainly possible. There are people that built distros, kind of geared in that direction. But you also see people building more, mechanical appliances, things that are driving motors. There's this tool called Linux CNC, and there's a nice distribution called Machine Kit for that. That's Debian based. And people will start hooking up motors and building things that will do mechanical construction. Lots of projects out there that are going on with it. The laser saw, I think, is an interesting one that you might want to look at sometime. It's a open hardware laser cutter, and people building some really cool things out of them.
So give us a little bit more background. I mean, I know you talked a little bit about, coming out of Texas Instruments and, working on that. How did this thing really get started, though? I mean, when did it get started? Was it around the same? It seems like this thing came out around the same time as the Arduino, but I may be mixing up my timeline a little bit. So what was the impetus for this? How did it get started? Who was involved? Can you give us some background on the project?
It came out a little bit later than the Arduino. I think the Arduino was in 2005 or 2006. We first launched in 2008. Of course, it's in a totally different caliber of performance than what you get with the 8-bit microcontrollers, or even the 32-bit, like the Arduino Due has a 32-bit ARM M series. We're using an A series, which is much higher performance than what you get out of something like that. And Arduino was geared at the start for designers, and then kind of spread out into the overall the maker movement. When we started out in 2008, we were really mostly focused on kind of the Linux heads, and it wasn't really until 2011 that we really focused more on all the what we found is all the maker community starting to really use these boards. We kind of just shifted our focus more to them with the Beaglebone. If you look at the original Beagleboard, it looks a lot more like a the concept was more of like a Mac Mini for ARM machines. But how that hooked so many people on Macs was let's show people what you can do with ARM processors, and then it's evolved to the Beaglebone. Yeah, that's what the original looks like. So you can see it's pretty different. There's not as much headers on there with the original Beagleboard for expansion. A lot of the I/O was at the 1.8 volt, and so it was a really wonderful platform, and a lot of people still use it today. We still have availability through distribution. We try to make sure that all our boards are available through distribution for 10 plus years. And that's really critical if you want to actually build on top of it. If you want to create curriculum, or you want to make sure that you can continue to show off your open source project, it's really critical that you can still get that same board years down the road.
I think that's really important, and I'm glad that you guys are doing that, because a lot of times, especially with these, I mean, even if you look at things like the cell phone market, right? I mean, if you have a phone, I mean, that phone's going to be obsolete in a year, right? And so people feel like if they're running, using a particular phone for more than 6 months, all of a sudden they're way behind the times, which is kind of an artificial thing in my opinion, but it is the world in which we live. So I think it's really important, and I'm glad you guys are able to keep up delivering those old models, especially as people are using these as part of a larger project, right? That they kind of depend on. I think that's great. You came, you worked at Texas Instruments, and in fact, you worked there for a long time. You don't look this old. I'm just looking at your bio. But you say you were employed there for 21 years. You don't look nearly that old.
Well, it's true. I've been there for 21 years. I started in '92. I was actually still in college at the time. The co-op program is a wonderful thing. But yeah, 21 years. I grew up in Texas. I worked there, and I moved to Michigan just a few years back. It's been a great company, and I love that I was able to kind of work myself into a position where I can go and pursue the projects that I'm really passionate about.
You don't sound like you're from Texas. I'll just throw that out there. I don't know how that happens, but so was Texas Instruments, I mean, were they supportive of this? I mean, they must have been, obviously, because you're still working for them. But how supportive were they, and how did you get funding from them to get this started, or how did that all work?
It was there wasn't a ton of interest at the beginning, so I ended up getting about $25,000 was the initial seed money to go and spin some board prototypes, and they're really there hasn't been a lot more monetary investment since then, but what there has been is that was a side project for me that was 10-15% of my time, and it's gotten to be where it's 90% of my time, and they still keep paying my salary. So there hasn't been a huge monetary investment from TI. We've kept this open hardware and made sure that when we choose parts from TI, they're parts that TI supports into the broad market catalog, and that they'll be available for a long time. So even if TI were to lose interest in it tomorrow, the guys manufacturing the boards could keep going on for years to come.
Great. So let's kind of kick it over to comparisons now, because I mentioned at the top of the show, a lot of people are familiar with Arduino because it's been around for a long time. And people are starting to become familiar with Raspberry Pi as well, because it's a cheap, kind of new educational bent platform, but a lot of people are using that in projects as well. So how would you compare between, we've already had some comparison to Arduino, how would you compare to the Raspberry Pi? What's different? Why would people want to go with a Beagleboard product like the Beaglebone or the Beaglebone Black now, as opposed to those other platforms?
I'll bring it back to the open hardware point, and so I'm not sure what everybody really knows about what open hardware is, but it means that we share all the design materials for the board, including the board layout, everything that you need, the bill of materials, and we make sure that all the components on the board are available through distributors in quantity one. So people are actually able to fully customize and make derived versions of the hardware, and that's something that you can't do with a Pi. It's also much more maker focused, right? You look at those expansion headers. You have a whole lot more GPIO capability. You have A to D converters. You have more pulse width modulators. You've got all the things that you'd want to try to build stuff out of when you start connecting up things to the real world, rather than just being an educational computer, which is for itself is a wonderful project. I think the Raspberry Pi is actually a fantastic project, and it's helped build a lot of visibility for these types of machines that we've been able to benefit from. But if you're actually wanting to try to make something, rather than just use it as a desktop computer, then the Beaglebone becomes a lot more practical for you. There's also the fact that it's more than twice as fast in raw CPU performance. So if you do want to start doing things like vision, those sort of applications that take a lot of CPU intensive things, then it's more practical for that. The last thing I'd kind of note on is that I slipped my head. All right.
Well, how you mentioned the CPU's faster. What about memory?
It's the same, I think. So at 512 megabytes, I think it's the same as what's on a Model B. We do have a built-in onboard flash, so 2 gigabytes of onboard flash, and the board ships with a distro on it, so you don't actually have to go buy an SD card or program an SD card in order to make it work. You just plug it in over a USB port and get going. And I think that the out-of-box experience with the Beaglebone Black is something that really stands out about it. I mean, literally, it comes with a USB cable and a board. You plug the board in, and whether you're running Mac, Linux, or Windows, all the drivers are there and everything you need to do to get started programming, and you don't have to go and download anything to actually get started. And I will say one thing about the price as well. I mean, it's just a different model. I mean, we're actually selling these to distributors at $35. I don't know if they like me saying that, but we're not against people making money, right? It's it's okay, right? So our list price is $45, and we're trying. It's sort of geared at different things. It's not we're happy with people adding value and doing custom things and changing the platform. So it's just a bit of a broader focus than what you get with a Pi. And going back to Arduino for a second, so the existing Arduinos, the Uno and the Due, if you're first getting into how to interact with these physical devices, learning how to talk to LEDs and sensors and relays, those guys are probably easier to get started with than picking up a Beaglebone. But when you're ready to start doing things with a more powerful computer, or you want to eliminate the computer that's tied up to your Beaglebone, to your Arduino. If you have a computer tied to an Arduino, that's when something like a Beaglebone becomes really helpful, when you want to try to eliminate that computer. And in fact, we've got a collaboration with Arduino for their new Arduino tray that tries to help people do exactly that, right? So it's essentially a Beaglebone plus an Arduino Leonardo all in one board.
Right, and that's kind of how I describe it to people is, if you're familiar with the Arduino and the Raspberry Pi, Beagleboard or Beaglebone Black specifically is somewhere in the middle, right? Because you get the benefit of running Linux on the board, kind of a standard Linux operating system, plus you have all those headers to be able to do something with. So are there shields available like there are for Arduino as well that you can just stack right on top of those headers?
Yeah, there's we have the name capes because when they, Underdog was a Beagle, and he wore a cape. And when the little add-on boards, when you plug them into there's a little cutout for the Ethernet header, so they end up looking like capes when you add them on, and all these other words for daughter boards, whether they're shields or capes or whatnot. Anyway, we call them capes. And there's over 50 of them out there for putting things like LCDs and different sensors, sort of just the ready-made stuff. I happen to have a little training cape on my board called a bacon cape, and it's just a really quick way to kind of get familiar with some sensors. So it's got an I2C accelerometer on it and some shift registers and a way to do A to D by changing a potentiometer and buttons and stuff. So it's just kind of a learning cape. But there's a lot of capes already out there and a whole lot more coming.
Yeah. So I could build one of these from scratch then if I wanted to, if I really wanted to. The specs are out there, the schematics and everything. I could go ahead and get some perf board and solder this thing together.
So the board itself, you're not going to solder down on a perf board. Certainly building some of the capes, Adafruit has a really nice proto board that you can use to solder some things together for building your own capes. If you wanted to actually customize the Beaglebone itself, and that's something we do highly encourage people to go do, you're probably going to need a contract assembly house to work with in order to do that, or you're going to want to have a pick and place machine of your own. But it's not probably something you want to do by hand. It does have some ball grid array components on it, so it's not the easiest to work with by hand. Like if you wanted to build an Arduino, that is something you could do to build by hand. But for a Beaglebone, you're probably going to want to work with somebody.
Yeah, I mean, this new board is tremendous. I think it came out. When did the new Beaglebone Black come out?
I believe it was April.
Yeah, I remember it was just before Maker Faire, Bay Area Maker Faire, right?
It was.
Yeah, because I remember seeing it there and kind of going a little bit gaga over it because for a couple reasons. Number one, the price point dropped. Well, here, let me just read what Make Magazine says about it. I'll just quote them. It says, Beaglebone Black moves the operating system off the SD card onto the onboard flash memory, freeing up the micro SD card slot for other purposes. Most crucially, however, the board has dropped in price from $89 to $45, which is real competition for the Pi's $35 retail price point, especially when you consider, and this is what we were talking about before, the Black's better specs, greater flexibility, and generally better user experience. So to me, that's high praise because for anyone that's a maker like me and is looking to get into use a platform to go do something, I want it to be easy. I want it to be highly configurable, and I don't want a lot of obstacles in the way. And it seems like that's what this new platform has really done for Beagleboard in general.
Yeah, absolutely, and that's kind of the very, very public secret out there that if you go to the maker fairs and you start kind of peeking under the covers of what people are building a lot of stuff out of, you'll find the Beaglebone Blacks everywhere. Even at that the Maker Faire back in the Bay Area in May, some of the biggest projects out there were actually being driven off of the Beaglebone. If you were in the dark room that had the arc, the arc reactor or whatever it was called in there,
right.
There was this huge LED wall that went up, I don't know, 30, 40 feet in the air, and people were playing Tetris on.
Right.
there was from the folks at coolneon.com. That was actually running off of a Beaglebone.
Nice.
Yeah, so they use the ability to shift out. The performance on the Beaglebone was something that they couldn't get out of that other little platform out there, that other little cheap Linux computer, and so they were running even that quick. They were running their demos off of Beaglebone. There were folks from Dorkbot PDX, so that's a little bit closer to Merlin. So if you ever get out to Dorkbot PDX, a lot of the guys out there are big fans of Beagle. There are projects everywhere, so it's kind of the little kept secret out in the maker community that the Beaglebone is really the way to go.
So what other cool projects? I mean, that's one obviously, but what are like the top 2 or 3 projects you've seen people do that kind of blow your mind?
Well, I love OpenROV. You mentioned that at the beginning of the show, and that's just such a fantastic story. David Lang has that book out, Zero to Maker, and I would that's kind of recommended reading, I think, for anybody interested in making things, and kind of give you that confidence that you don't need to be very far along to decide to go on that journey. And so the OpenROV is a fantastic one. I like Ninja Blocks. It's kind of that Internet of Things. They take a Beaglebone and an Arduino-like machine and marry them together and allow you to just use simple cloud services, open hardware, open software to connect and automate everything in your home. So if you have wireless or wired devices, and you want a real easy interface to control them. If you've heard of If This Then That, it gives you that sort of ability to control them, so you don't actually have to do any programming. I mentioned the laser saw earlier. I think that one's super cool. It's not out yet, but it shows you some of the capability of the board. It's that one's an open hardware laser cutter. So you can cut out wood and plastic and do your own manufacturing. The folks at Tempo Automation are working on a pick and place machine, an open hardware pick and place machine built around the Beaglebone. Love that one. The guy named Phil Polstra has this thing called the Deck. And he recently went to DEF CON and presented his concept of these quadcopters that could go land on top of buildings and do penetration testing on them and get into the Wi-Fi networks and use XB to communicate to this stream of devices miles away.
Holy moly!
Wow.
So that one was really cool. To me, there was an Indiegogo recently for a first-person a flight controller. So with your cell phone, kind of like the OpenROV, where you get this video stream back when you're controlling your underwater robot. This one was for flying vehicles, and it used the 3G, 4G cell phone network, so you could fly a plane anywhere and get this first-person view of what you're flying. I could just keep going on for days. I probably should cut that off.
Maybe I shouldn't have asked that question. I don't know. That's awesome.
So, I'm not much of a hardware guy. I think the last time I picked up a soldering iron was back in high school, and I was doing that to build an MSI 8080, so that really dates me back to the early days. But I'm more interested in the programming aspect of this thing. So how do I interact with this thing? Do I SSH into the Beagleboard and use a text editor natively on the machine, or do I edit it somewhere else and then ship it down, or what? What's a typical workflow for programming one of these?
So people really come at it based on where their experiences are. It's a Linux computer, and you're able to just come at it with wherever your experience. And there's actually a built-in web-based IDE. It's a Cloud9, and you could actually just point your web browser to the board and actually start coding it up with a JavaScript library that allows you to do basic physical interactions, do things like flip LEDs and control motors and read light sensors and do all those things actually just from JavaScript. It's running Node.js by default, and you just use the Cloud9 IDE and just start going to town. Adafruit has released a Python IDE. So it's also actually running on Node.js, but you're editing in Python, and they've released a Python library for that and have some fantastic tutorials on how to get started doing physical computing tasks in Python. Of course, if you're already an experienced Linux person, just SSHN and Vim or Nano, the board ships with auto tools. I've mentioned it's got Python and JavaScript interpreters, but there's also Perl. People add Ruby, people program in Java, people use Eclipse on their host machines and use the GDB connection to program, to write C programs and to debug C programs. So people really come at it from all sorts of different angles. Matt Richardson just put out a book that launched on Kindle recently and should be out next week on getting started with Beaglebone. And it really focuses on doing development in Python and JavaScript for people who are pretty new to programming and brand new to Linux.
And are there higher level libraries? I know Node.js is very event driven, but are there higher level libraries for all those languages to talk about, well, when this sensor gets to this point, this is the sequence of actions that I want to take? Because I'm sure that most of this has to be more event-driven programming than anything else, right?
Yeah, you can do some things sequentially, but I think that JavaScript is actually really nice for doing things because of that event-driven nature. And so I actually maintain a JavaScript library called BoneScript for the Beaglebone that you can use directly within that IDE, the Cloud9 IDE, so that you just never even have to leave your web browser and you're starting doing physical computing. In fact, it's really easy to start tying up physical interactions to things that happening in a web page, right? To start using jQuery or even processing JS or any number of JavaScript utilities in a web browser and start having those physical interactions show up there. That's something that we support out of the box, really, really, really easy. But there's also a Python library. Adafruit has done some really great tutorials. But that Python library provides you the ability to read the ADCs, read the GPIO pins, know when something's pressed, know what an analog value is, start doing pulse width modulator stuff if you want to control the speed of motors or the position of a servo. So those things are all there without you having to understand the low-level Linux-y things of it.
Is that the web IDE? Is that the one?
Yeah, the Adafruit web IDE.
Right.
The library is called PyBBIO. I believe Alexander Haim started the original version. I think Matt Richardson contributed a few things to it. But then I think Justin Cooper and a couple of other people involved with Adafruit have continued to move that along. So the Adafruit web IDE. I think they initially developed that for the Raspberry Pi, and then they've moved that on over to Beaglebone and extended the I/O library so that you're not just writing Python code that runs. You're actually able to do real physical interactions.
Right, and they have a nice write-up there, like you mentioned, on the getting the IDE installed on the Beaglebone, and how to get it up and running, how to connect to it. I mean, they do a really good job there of making it as easy as possible for people to get started, which is great.
And I'm slowly increasing my expertise in Dart, and it sounds like Dart would be a nice logical next step if you already have good JavaScript interfaces and implementations. Are you familiar with Dart?
Slightly. I've seen Dart. I think it's reasonable. I'm kind of just hooked on kind of raw JavaScript just because it really is everywhere. So I've played with Google Blockly. I've got an implementation if you want to do kind of drag and drop programming and to build up JavaScript. I've taken the physical JavaScript libraries, and you can actually just do drag and drop with Blockly in order to add those. I've also put Google, is it Coder? I think it's what it's called.
Yep. Yeah. Google Coder.
So Google Coder also runs on the Beaglebone Black just fine.
I didn't know that.
Cool.
I actually, that was my tip of the week on This Week in Google last time I was on, was Google Coder, and I demonstrated it running on the Pi. I didn't realize it ran on the Beaglebone as well.
Yeah, I did a write-up on how to install it within like 2 days of it being launched.
Very nice. Hey, we haven't talked much about the community. So what's the community governance like, and how do you participate with each other, and what do you discuss?
Oh, well, that's a great question. The community is very, very dynamic, and of course it's changing over time as we kind of move from more of a hardcore Linux focus up to more of a maker focus, and that's been an interesting dynamic. Our core mailing list is a bit over 7,000 people. It's very active, and the guy that actually designed the hardware, Gerald Coley, is extremely active and responsive on that mailing list, and it's very focused on sort of Q&A and here's what I did over my summer vacation sort of posts. But we have an IRC channel. Typically been around 200 people logged into our IRC channel, and I'm more active there than I am on the mailing list. And people can always contact me there, Jay Kreidner, on #beagle@freenode.net. So those are the kind of the two key places where we have a lot of community interactions, but we also tend to have meetups at some of the more popular Linux shows, especially Embedded Linux Conference, and then the Maker Fair. So we have a lot of interactions there. There's starting to be meetups that pop up different places for users groups. I know that in Chicago there's with a group called Not Exclusively Raspberry Pi out of Pumping Station 1.
Nice.
And that's where we do see a lot more focus coming from people that are trying to make with the Raspberry Pi, and then want to be able to do more than what it allows them to do, and they're looking for something in that same price range, and so that's a good choice. And then they start to find religion sometimes around this whole open hardware concept.
And do you have like an oversight committee, who decides sort of the ultimate direction that the projects are going in, or is that just really just magically consensus and it's just seemed to work so far?
The actual foundation board is just myself, Gerald, and Clint. And Clint is owns the company that manufactures the boards and actually assembles them and ships them. And we're still actually working on our bylaws and trying to get it where the community has more official say-so on what we're doing. We do keep a separate list of people that are kind of the key influencers, and we interact with them. We ship them early boards. They tell us what they like and what they don't like, and that's all based on how active they are and participating in the community. So right now it's kind of a hand selection process. Where those people that are giving the most to the community, we try to listen to them the most. And allow them to have their input, but we're always open to suggestions in the mailing list. And Gerald, the hardware designer, inevitably replies to every single one of those with his reasonings on why he's made one choice versus another. So that's how most of the design decisions ultimately get made is what people tell Gerald they care about on the mailing list.
Cool. And I've noticed that, at least if I think I got this right chronologically, from the oldest thing you made to the newest thing you made, it got smaller and more powerful and cheaper. I don't understand that. How did that happen?
The Beagleboard and the Beagleboard XM, we actually made one step in the other direction, which was extra MIPS, extra memory. And we ended up keeping the price the same and dropping the price of the original board. So that was, we did actually start in that direction of going up and up. But when we kind of the feedback from the community is we want something we can make more physical interaction things out of, and that's how we ended up with the Beagle Bone. And then again, cheaper was kind of the push, and then we got to the Beagle Bone Black.
Okay, well, that sort of makes sense, I guess. Anyway, I thought it might be something about economy of scale, but it sounds like you're
actually
getting
the economy of scale that's a really great point. When you look at why is the Beaglebone Black so much cheaper than the original Beaglebone, and if you look at the parts, like we made it faster, we added HDMI, we did remove the USB to serial, but that wasn't really a heavily used feature. Well, how did we go from almost $90 to under $50, and that really was mostly the economy of scale. We did get some better pricing on memories. We got some but we were able to build 100,000 at a time now instead of 10,000 at a time, and that made a huge difference. And a lot of that's thanks to the Raspberry Pi folks, because they really just increased the visibility of these things.
Now, I don't know if you can talk about this, and if you can't, just say, no, I can't talk about it. But every time I've worked for a large corporation, there's been some sort of agreement that even things I do off hours belong to them. And I'm wondering how you were able to work for TI and still have the Beagleboard show up.
Open hardware, open software, right? So it's because the things that I do for TI in this realm are all done as open source. Even though TI may maintain the copyright, everybody's able to do with it what they want, because we release it under an open source license. So that's how I can still manage to be paid by TI and not have TI have exclusive access to the things that I create.
Was that hard to get across to management that you wanted to do something like this?
It was an evolution. So there were other things I think were ahead of this. To really show management what the real power and benefits are of engaging the open source community, and that's something that's it's evolved a lot over time, and I feel like I've had a lot of influence over changing some of that, changing some of those opinions over time. But I think that a lot of people at TI are really strong believers in what open source can do, both for TI and for the world.
And do the copyrights still belong to TI for the majority, or are the copyrights held by the original contributors for the most part, or is there some assignment that has to happen?
In general, the copyrights are owned by the contributors, right? So if you look at the way the Linux kernel contributions are, and how the copyrights manage there, we follow a lot of similar policies on other things that are that are outside the Linux kernel. And so those things are owned by the copyrights are held by the original creator. So if it's coming from somebody inside TI, it's TI. If it's coming by somebody outside of TI, it's them personally or the company that they work for, whatever agreements they have. But it's all assigned under an open source license. So everybody has access to modify the source and do with it what they want. If it happens to be GPL, then they're required to share source back. A lot of things are also done under either a BSD or Apache licenses in the user space.
Do you have a specific open source hardware license that you're using?
We've kind of created our own. So we follow Creative Commons for the most part in terms of licensing the hardware design. But we've kind of a little bit of roll your own open source hardware license, but I think you'll see that it's pretty flexible if you go and look at the license around the design materials. Did
you look at OSI's licenses in that area?
So I think the OSI around hardware is fairly new. We were involved in the periphery with the starting of the Open Source Hardware Association, and some of the things that they've done to kind of create open hardware licenses. We don't. A lot of the stuff that's been done on open source hardware licensing didn't exist when we started the project.
Sure. Yeah, I can understand that because you're definitely doing some pioneering work there. I'm supposed to ask you about the Beaglebone Mustache Cam.
Oh, no. Okay. I was looking for ways to kind of show off the ability of the board to do some higher level processing, and I actually tried to brainstorm with my wife some ideas, and she just told me mustaches are cool, and well, I didn't know. So it was pretty low-hanging fruit for me to go and create something that would detect somebody's face and apply a mustache to it. I probably should have brought one here. I don't think I was quite prepared for that one, but it's actually been a really big hit. I go around trade shows with this wearable camera that I put an LCD on it. I use a cell phone battery, and then I just have a PlayStation 3 eye on top to do the web capture. And I walk around and superimpose mustaches on people's faces, and then if I press a button, it will take a picture of them and post it on Twitter using the USB or using the Wi-Fi adapter and my cell phone as a hotspot. So I walk around tweeting mustaches at people at trade shows.
Okay, of all the uses that I've heard for this so far, I like that one the best. This sounds pretty cool.
Well, if you want to make your own, beagleboard.org/project/stash, then you can get all the build instructions and make your own.
That's awesome. I'm glad John doesn't have one for this show. That would be
I actually wrote it during a meeting. So we had like this half-day meeting, and I actually sat down and wrote the application during a meeting. So if I could do that, you can go and build your own Mustache Cam.
Sounds like it. Power. You brought that up a moment ago that you're powering with a cell phone battery. What's the power consumption of this? I suppose it really just depends on what else you have wired into it, but and how do people typically power this, I guess, in portable situations?
So I find the easiest way to power it is off of cell phone chargers, right? So this happens to be I'm holding in my hand a Kickstarter battery that is now available for sale. The show notes who it came from, but it's essentially like a cell phone battery that provides USB out. So it's got 5 volts out, and that's how you power the board off of it. So you can power it off of USB, or you can power it off of a 5 volt barrel adapter. And so I'll take one of these and charge them up, and then run off of those. So Anchor has some really nice USB cell phone chargers and things like that. But also there's some people built capes where you can power off of AA batteries, or people power off of 9 volts, and they'll use these step down converters to go from the 9 volts into.
May have lost Jason there for just a second. I've got an Anchor actually that I use for my Raspberry Pi. It works really well. And the nice thing about this is it's got a couple different outputs for USB, and then it's also got a 12 volt output. So if you need to, if you want to power a small, what I do with that is I power a small 4-inch TFT display, so that I can plug that right in. So I've got my display. Everything's portable. I can power the display. I can power the device. This happens to be a 10,000 milliamp unit. It's a little bit more expensive. I think it was about 45, maybe $50, but this thing will last all day on a single charge easily.
Wow.
Powering one of these devices. So there are cheaper options like the other one he was showing, but that's a really good one too. And so there are a lot of options. I'm kind of curious just on this point. I've got to jump in a little bit and ask, because there's been some problems with Raspberry Pi with people that try to push it a little too hard, and they want to plug in a camera, and they want to plug in a Wi-Fi dongle, and they want to plug in a bunch of other USB devices, and there's not enough power to power the board and those devices too. Do you recommend getting a hub for those types of applications? Are there similar issues with? I'm assuming there are, because it's a basic power consumption issue, right?
So there's a little bit difference in how we wire up the power. So if you bring in power through the 5 volt barrel jack, there's just there's very little. So we pass that on directly to the USB jack. So you can get a lot of power out through that just by providing that enough current in through that 5-volt barrel jack. So we don't put another regulator in between there. So you can pass all that stuff through. And that's why, why do we run off of 5 volts instead of, like an Arduino runs from like 6 to 12 volts or any of that. And a lot of that is about that USB power. So we can provide the power to those USB devices. So as long as your regulator can provide it through that barrel jack, we're good. I do recommend using USB hubs for a lot of situations. One of the differences is we only have one dedicated a host port on the Beaglebone. To get to more devices or to get to more power requirements, putting in a hub is a great thing. But if you're trying to optimize your system and you only have one USB device, just going through the barrel jack and provide enough current that way, it's going to be okay.
Yep.
So the Black came out about 6 months ago, and nothing new since then. You guys are slacking. No, what's on the roadmap? What's coming up next?
Well, we recently had that announcement of the Arduino tray. So that's a collaboration between Arduino and Beagleboard.org. So we see a lot of people in our community kind of work in that configuration of microcontroller plus the Linux side on the Beaglebone, and that's really all about getting that Arduino experience to people and leveraging the open hardware nature of the Beaglebone. And then as far as whatever else, I'd absolutely recommend joining the mailing list, joining the community, providing your input. There's always stuff going on. There's always new development. So I'd say pay attention to that.
And if you could solicit for particular kinds of people that you find the most shortage of, what would those kinds of people be?
The people that I'm really surprised haven't shown up to the community more are the Node.js folks, right? So I kind of give them some top billing in the out of box stuff that I've put together, so that it starts off running this Node.js server. We've got npm, and I'm surprised more of that high level Python JavaScript world doesn't come in more, and we still end up with a lot more of the makers who I love, and I definitely feel like I'm a part of that community and the more the hardcore Linux heads. But the people coming from desktop server world and higher level languages seem to be a little bit underrepresented. We do have some great participation from the Java world and from a lot of other Internet of Things framework folks, but if I'm going to do a shout out to anybody, it's probably the JavaScript and Python world.
Cool. And we're almost out of time, but I just want to make sure we've covered everything you want our audience to hear about. Is there anything you think we've left out that we should talk about for a minute or two?
And this is a bit of a for experts only thing. Is there are a couple of 32-bit microcontrollers on there that run at 200 megahertz. 5 nanosecond cycles, and those actually have the ability to do some direct interaction with the pins, so that they can read and write pins on a single cycle basis, and the registers can see it. Now, right now, there's only an open source assembler out there for supporting it. TI does have a beta C compiler for it, but that's going to be a closed source. So I'd love to see somebody do some open source C compiler support for that. But a lot of people have gotten a long way with just the assembler and are using the TI beta compiler. There's this project called the Disorient Pyramid. It was taken to Burning Man, where they're controlling over 16,000 LEDs using these little microcontrollers to kind of shift those out and play live video and move really cool things across those LEDs. That's something I'd want people to kind of take a look at.
Cool. As I said a moment ago, we're running out of time, so I would like to... I have to ask my 2 important questions, though. What's your favorite text editor?
Vim.
Yay!
I never would ever recommend anybody else to ever use it or even bother learning it. But if I'm going to edit something, I want to do it fast, and I'm going to use Vim.
You know, I have to say, occasionally, when I don't want to wait for Emacs to fire up on a remote machine, I just use VI. I admit it. I admit it. So I'm not pure Emacs. I'm whatever gets started faster. But mostly I have
which is always Vim.
I have no. If I have Emacs inside a TMUX session, then it's running all the time.
Cheating.
It's already running. Okay,
it's already running. So I boot Emacs about once a month on my main server, and so I don't have to worry about the startup time because it's already running there. It's already going that well. And I'm probably not going to like the answer to the next one either. I can already guess. But your favorite scripting language?
This is a bit more of a pragmatic thing, just because it's so pervasive, right? It's really, really, really everywhere, and it's JavaScript. It looks enough like C to me that I can kind of treat it in that C-ish way. You know, I love curly braces. Sorry, Python guys, but I'm kind of hooked on those, and so yeah, JavaScript. Love Perl.
Okay. That's not bad then. It's just actually I kind of like JavaScript, and I was on a panel once with is his name Brendan, the guy that created it? I forget now. Sorry about that guy. And he started out the conversation by immediately apologizing for the optional semicolons and new line interpretation rule. So, but he started out by saying, that was a mistake. I should have never done it that way, but too bad. It's in the ECMAScript now, so that's the way it is. Okay, well, this has been wonderful having you on to talk about the Beagle community and the Beagle boards and all that sort of stuff. And really appreciate you coming on and talking about the project today.
Thanks, Randall. Really appreciate you having me on the show.
Very good. That was Jason Cridner, the one of the key people involved with Beagle. What do you think there, Aaron?
Well, yeah, I mean, you know, for me, right? I mean, this is kind of right up my alley. So this is great. Yes. You know, I feel privileged to talk to Jason and all the other people I meet that make these kind of things and have ideas for these kind of things. It's like, you know, you don't. I don't know, maybe he does. I don't think people realize what this has created for the community of makers, like the things you can do with these products now that you've never been able to do before, or at least not as easily, right? I mean, before you were, you know, physically assembling chips and things on a board and trying to get that to work so that you could just make a LED blink, you know, and now it's like, oh, you just pick up this really cheap piece of hardware, it runs great, you can put Linux on it, it does this, it does that, and you can make it portable. It's like, you know, it really is a maker's dream. And the fact that it's open hardware. I mean, this show is obviously about open source software, but open hardware is great. The fact that the schematics are published and all the things are under a you know, their own open hardware license, but it is open. It's freely available for people to take and do with what they want. I think it's just great. I could gush over this for a long time. I've got a project coming up that I'm working on, which is to, when my dog barks at the door, which I don't want him to do, I want it to recognize that and shake a can, which he hates, so that over time it'll train him not to bark at the door when the doorbell rings. So I was going to do that on Raspberry Pi. Maybe I'll do it on a Beaglebone.
Wow, and appropriate being a Beaglebone.
Exactly.
For your dog.
Exactly. I mean, it's kind of hard not to now, right? I mean, I'll be honest, I haven't played around with Beaglebone that much just because, you know, I got started with Arduino and then kind of went to the Raspberry Pi and I've been all into that. But the fact that you can do, you control more inputs, it has a faster processor, which a lot of times the Raspberry Pi, I'll be honest, suffers from the fact that their processor isn't quite fast enough. People are driving it too hard. Makes me really want to get started on this. So yeah, I think I need to get one.
And I'm probably preaching to the choir here, chatting with you, and not that you're the choir, but pointing in your direction. I'm really happy for the maker community. I'm not like a big participant in it, of course, except from the sort of distant software level. But because, you know, back in the old days, we had, you know, real hardware that we could assemble together. We could read Popular Electronics and assemble the kits that were listed there. Heathkit and all these other companies were out there building stuff. I remember building tons of stuff. You know, I kind of joked about not picking up a soldering iron since high school, but that really, most of my stuff was back in those days. And then we got into the era where everything was all miniaturized and boxized in the sense that it became this whole thing that you couldn't do anything with. Kind of like the same problem happened with cars, where you originally had carburetors and things you could get your hands on. Now all we have is these super smart chips in there that are doing all that work. And it's hard to tinker with that without really being able to change the software in it. So I'm really liking what's happening here with things like Arduino and Beagleboard and Raspberry Pi, where they're starting to, again, empower individuals to build things from scratch, but now using even the same technology that they have in their cell phone or in their, in their desktop computer.
Right, and it's not just for people. It's not just for people like me that want to get into this. It's the really cool thing, I think, is that it's going down in age so that young people can actually get started on this really easy, and they can see how things work and they can build things. It's hands-on. It's STEAM in schools. It's empowering all sorts of educational opportunities, as well as just maker and hacker and tinkerer opportunities as well. So there's that aspect to it as well, which is why I love getting involved in this sort of thing. So anyway, I could go on and on. I better stop.
Yeah, we're just, like I said, we are almost out of time here. So speaking of almost out of time, let's talk about some upcoming guests. We've got next week is QGIS, which is a desktop geographic information system, so you can plot maps and plot data on maps and things like that. Just added to the schedule, we've had OpenSUSE on the program before, but there's a new project called the OpenSUSE Summit, which means we're going to get together specifically about OpenSUSE rather than it being part of some other conference like it typically has been. GPotter is coming up after that. That's a podcast manager. Some of you, in fact, may be listening to this show on GPotter, and thank you for that because it's open source, listening about open source. We'll bring the author of that on. And also just added to the schedule is RDO, which are three initials that I don't know exactly what it means, but it's something about OpenStack. It's sort of the OpenStack community finally coming together. OpenStack, of course, coming out of Red Hat, has been sort of driven by Red Hat, but now they're sort of creating sort of a community edition and really starting to bring that together as well. So we'll have a representative from them to talk about that. So for those of you that miss all that talk we had about clouds earlier this year, we're going to bring back some clouds. We're going to bring the clouds back. And then finally, the last one scheduled so far is Crossroads, which is a fork of ZeroMQ. We had Peter Hitchens on talking about ZeroMQ, but it's been forked, and we'll talk to the guy who forked it to talk about why he did it and what the implications of that are and what new directions he's heading with his fork of ZeroMQ that he's got. We've still got a few more slots left in Q4. I'm going to, as soon as those are full, I'm going to open up Q1 so we can start getting some more people on the long list. You can go to twit.tv/floss to see our big spreadsheet of all the upcoming guests and all the potential future guests that we have there. If there's somebody there that that's always backwards. If there's somebody you want on the show and they aren't there yet, have the project leader email me, merlin@stonehenge.com, and we will talk to them and get them on that schedule. You can follow us at Floss Weekly on Google+, or at Floss Weekly on Twitter. We do have a live chat. We took a couple questions from the live chat today. That's on while we're taping the show, which is 8:30 a.m. ungodly early Pacific time on Wednesdays. A few exceptions to that. Go check the spreadsheet to see if there's a change to that schedule. You can follow me at Merlin on Twitter. You can also more likely follow me on Google+ at Randall L. Schwartz. I post prolifically there. Actually, I've got a pretty good cloud score now. My cloud score is up to 69 now, which is really nice. A lot of followers there. I'm sorry I didn't mention this until yesterday because I completely forgot the last two scheduled weeks that I was actually on the show. The podcast awards that are given every year were open for nominations. And so luckily, a bunch of people nominated Floss Weekly in the technical category this week, technology category this year. I will let you know when voting opens so you can go vote. Hopefully we got enough nominations to actually make it onto the ballot. But I came real close to winning one year, but Steve Gibson beat me out. So it's like, okay, I want to actually win it this time. So we'll see how that goes. That's all the plugging I want to do right now. Actually, one more thing. I may be looking for work in January. So if you need a good Perl hacker or a good technical writer or a good sysadmin or a DevOps guy, merlin@stonehenge.com. I may be looking for work anywhere on the West Coast would be best, but I will work anywhere in the U.S. if it's good money. All right, that's enough plugging for me. Aaron, what do you want to plug?
If you need a good Perl hacker, everyone needs a good Perl hacker, right?
Yeah.
Okay,
and
so
can afford me.
Here's my plugs for today. So you can follow me on Google+, add me to your circles. That's where I hang out most of the time, and I interact with people there. Lots of people have come on lately and said, "Oh, we really enjoy your podcast and everything. And what did you think about this when you were talking to Jeff Jarvis about such and such?" And I'm happy to respond to those. And I really can't do it on Facebook or Twitter very easily, but I live in Google Plus. So please add me to your circles there. And a lot of you have been, so thank you very much for that. If you missed it, I was on All About Android last night, where I'm occasional co-host, so you can rewind, or if you haven't downloaded it yet, go download All About Android. It's a great show last night. And that'll be on Twig upcoming this afternoon. So if you're watching live, keep that live stream going, and you can pick up at 1 o'clock while I'll be co-hosting This Week in Google. Or again, if you're watching this recorded, if you've downloaded it, you need to go check out that show as well, because I'll be on Twig later on. Yeah, that's about it.
Well, Aaron, we could have talked to this guy. I could have talked to Jason for another hour or so. So I'm glad we're finally wrapping up. And you had some very insightful questions. So thank you for being on today's show.
Absolutely. Anytime. Very
cool. Very cool. Well, that's about all we have for this week. And so we'll say what I usually stumble over at the end of the show, like I am already. We'll see you again next time on Floss Weekly.